Let's talk about reparations. Over the past few years, there's been increasing pressure, mainly from Labour MPs and other annoying people, for Britain, America and other countries to pay reparations to Africa and its diaspora population over the so-called wrongs of the British Empire and slavery. But I'd like to bring up a few points. First of all, who was responsible for slavery, point one. Secondly, who's alive today, has benefited from slavery. And thirdly, who should pay what. Firstly, slavery, when I talk about slavery, I'm talking about the Atlantic slave trade, not the slave trade before it or the slave trade after it. I apologise if it's a bit windy at the moment. Basically, without going into too much detail, the Atlantic slave trade was Africans selling other Africans to Europeans to be transported to the Americas. And basically, if the Europeans hadn't bought them, they would have probably remained slaves in Africa, in which case they would have probably led a lot worse lives than they did in the Caribbean and what's now the United States of America. Or they may have actually just been killed, because they was basically captured in like battles between different tribes and things like that, and hunting expeditions and things like that. So they was enslaved by their own people and taken to America and the Caribbean, and they led better lives than they would have done there. In fact, a lot more European or British sailors died on the triangular slave trade than slaves, because the slaves were considered high value, and then on the return trip the sailors weren't really needed, and if they died it meant that the merchants who owned the ships didn't have to pay them. And secondly, like who has benefited from the slave trade? Who's alive today has benefited from the slave trade? I haven't. Most white Europeans and Americans and Australians and whoever else haven't. Obviously there was some money made at the time from the slave trade, but more of that was made from more of the money was made from manufacture than it was from the slave trade. And the people who have benefited from it is the diaspora Africans in America, the Caribbean, and the ones who've now come here. Because if their ancestors had just been left in Africa, they almost certainly wouldn't be alive today. And if they were alive today, they'd have a lot worse lives in Africa than they have now. So if anyone's benefited from the slave trade, it's the blacks in Britain, America, the Caribbean, Canada, and where else they've gone, the descendants of the slaves. Also, the third point I'd like to raise is how much have we already paid? We've probably paid over £100 billion, allowing for inflation, to Africa in foreign aid, gift aid on private donations, and also the Africans have benefited from European ingenuity. Billions of pounds a year is spent by the British taxpayer, by the NHS, by American private insurance on developing cures for diseases and medications to treat other ailments. And then the Africans just benefit from that because they get access to the same medication that we've paid for the research to develop. Also, even things like engineering and house building and things like that, so many things have been developed by Europeans, and the Africans have benefited from that, where we haven't really benefited from anything that they've developed. So really, if anything, I'd say there was call for them to actually pay us back some of what we've already paid them, because I think we've well overpaid, considering that the ones who are alive today are the ones who've actually benefited from the slave trade. All in all, it probably doesn't really matter whether we owe them reparations or not, because as their population increases here, they're just going to vote to give themselves reparations whether they deserve them or not. They're not asking for reparations because they feel they deserve them. They're asking for reparations because they think we're weak. They think we're weak because we've given them foreign aid. They think we're weak because we've allowed them to come over here. Basically the white man rolls over for them all the time, and they consider us weak. And even if we paid them the reparations that they're demanding, they just demand some more, won't they? They're not just going to be happy with that. They want the reparations because we're weak, not because of anything we've done. And also at the time of slavery, it's not as if the white people in Britain were living in the lap of luxury. Obviously some very rich people were, but it wasn't as if the normal working people were playing computer games and driving cars and all sorts of things that are kind of taken for granted today. Back at the time, children were getting sent down mines and up chimneys and things like that, and that was all year round. Things like the cotton picking, you'd only get about 12 weeks of that tops a year. The actual hard graft that's sort of renowned that slavery's associated with, when realistically a lot of the time they wouldn't be working anywhere near that hard. It'd only be for like 12 or 14 weeks a year when they're actually picking cotton.